What if I told you that the collapse of the USSR was not a political tragedy, but the greatest financial scam in history? While millions of people were standing in line for food, a narrow circle of individuals was funneling hundreds of billions of dollars into secret accounts in Switzerland. We have found traces of this money. In this video, we will show how an entire empire was stolen right under the noses of 290 million people, who was behind this grandiose plan, and why the truth is still classified. You will be shocked when you find out where this money is now. In the minds of millions, the Soviet Union remained a colossus with feet of clay, a mighty military power with a perpetual shortage of goods, lines for sausage, and modest salaries for engineers. This image, carefully cultivated for decades, was only one side of the coin, visible and understandable to the average person. But behind the facade of a planned economy and universal equality lay another reality. A reality of a giant shadow financial empire operating with colossal sums in hard currency. The USSR was not just a country, it was a corporation whose revenues were measured in billions of dollars. And when this colossus collapsed, not only ideological dogmas were buried under its rubble, but also countless treasures. The main question that still stirs the minds of researchers and economists sounds disconcertingly simple. How could a country that possessed, by the most conservative estimates, a fortune comparable to the budgets of several European states, suddenly become bankrupt? Where did this money disappear to? This is not a story about bankruptcy. This is a story about the most grandiose and imperceptible disappearance of assets in modern history. To understand the scale of the tragedy, one must return to the 1970s. It was then, against the backdrop of the global energy crisis, that the Soviet Union realized itself not only as an ideological leader, but also as a major player in the energy market. Two rivers flowed from the Siberian depths to the west. One, visible to all, was a river of black, thick oil and blue gas flowing through pipelines to Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The second river, invisible and secret, was a river of foreign currency flowing in the opposite direction. These were not just rubles that could be printed in any quantity. These were dollars, German marks, Swiss francs, British pounds, hard convertible currency, the lifeblood of the global economy. The state received billions. In 1990 alone, already at the end of its existence, the country sold oil for over $30 billion, a figure comparable to the country's entire gold and foreign exchange reserves. This golden rain became especially heavy in the 80s, when world oil prices skyrocketed, and the Politburo could afford to literally bathe in currency. But this money did not simply dissolve in the general pot of the Soviet budget, going to pensions, hospitals, and defense. A significant part of it settled in special secret accounts abroad, forming a parallel financial system, the existence of which the vast majority of Soviet citizens and even many officials were unaware. These funds were supposed to be the financial safety net that would save the country in the event of a severe crisis. But when the crisis did strike, the pillow turned out to be empty. The answer to the question, why, lies in where and, most importantly, how these untold riches were stored. The system for storing Soviet assets was ingenious in its complexity and opacity. It was not a centralized treasury, but a branched, mushroom-like network that had spread throughout the world. Money was not concentrated in one place, but was deliberately scattered among many secret structures, front organizations, and numbered accounts. The geography of this financial web was astonishing. Respectable banks in Switzerland, where banking secrecy was elevated to a cult, quiet financial havens in Austria and Luxembourg, business centers in Great Britain and Germany, and later, more exotic destinations like Cyprus, Singapore, and even offshore zones in South America. This empire was not managed by simple clerks. The keys to the secret treasury were in the hands of a narrow circle of initiates, the top management of the Bank of the USSR, trusted individuals from the Ministry of Finance, and of course officers from special economic units of the KGB. All operations, all accounts, all transactions were classified as secret or of particular importance. The scale of this network became clear only after the collapse of the Union, when CIA analysts in 1991 officially announced the existence of more than 600 foreign accounts directly linked to Soviet structures. They were also the first to raise the alarm, reporting that in the last months of the USSR's existence, these accounts began to be actively cleared. Funds from them were rapidly transferred to new addresses, with recipients being not only anonymous organizations, but also private individuals. A special role in this system was played by so-called sleeper funds. These were accounts to which funds were transferred for decades, after which they froze, showing no activity. They lay motionless, like financial time bombs, waiting for their hour. One such fund was accidentally discovered in 2012 in one of the offshore zones. $17 billion lay dormant in the account. Formally, they belonged to a long-defunct Soviet organization, but 20 years later it was impossible to prove who had the legal right to them. This complex and confusing system, created to protect state assets from external threats, ultimately became the perfect tool for their appropriation from within. When the walls of the Soviet Empire cracked, those who were supposed to guard the treasury were the first to begin dismantling it. In the last months of the USSR's existence, from the end of 1990 to the end of 1991, a quiet panic began in the highest echelons of power. Many no longer had illusions. The system was collapsing before their eyes, and it was necessary to prepare for a new life. For some of the party and economic elite, preparation meant one thing: creating backup airfields and transferring state assets under personal control. An operation began that can be called the Great Escape. Bank, once the pride of the Soviet financial system, was transformed into a giant gateway for the withdrawal of funds. Under the guise of financial stabilization, debt restructuring, and attracting investment, vigorous activity unfolded. Accounts were hastily rewritten to new details. Dozens of front structures and private twin companies were created, which were like two peas in a pod to state foreign trade associations. Then these twins inherited the assets and contracts of their state prototypes using fictitious documents. Millions and billions of dollars, marks, and francs flowed from state accounts to accounts controlled by a narrow circle of individuals. But the most devastating blow to the possibility of ever finding this money was struck after the official collapse of the country in 1992. Then, according to various estimates, more than 80% of the Bank archives, containing invaluable data on currency transactions, were either destroyed or placed in special storage with a classification that made them inaccessible for decades. This was tantamount to burning all the maps after the treasure had been dug up and carried away. Documents that could shed light on how much money the USSR had abroad, where it was located, and who became its new owner, turned into ashes or are gathering dust on classified shelves. Against the backdrop of this grandiose redistribution, the tragedy of the entire country unfolded. While former officials and directors of enterprises were opening accounts in Swiss banks and buying real estate on the Côte d'Azur, millions of their fellow citizens were standing in endless lines for bread, losing their jobs due to the collapse of factories, and trying to survive in conditions of galloping inflation. The contrast was monstrous and became a symbol of that era. Some inherited poverty and chaos, others, the untold riches of a vanished country. When the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin in December 1991, not only a political but also a legal vacuum arose. Who now owns all the accumulated wealth? After all, the USSR was a union of 15 republics, and each had the right to its share of the inheritance. However, a fateful decision was made. Recognized by the UN and most countries of the world, Russia was declared the legal successor of the Soviet Union. This meant that Russia assumed not only all international obligations of the USSR, including a giant national debt of more than $100 billion, but also received rights to all its assets. On paper, everything looked logical. In reality, Russia received the role of an heir, who inherited all the debts of his wealthy relative, but discovered that the safe with his fortune was empty. A long and almost hopeless battle for the return of money began. More than 10 lawsuits were filed in international courts of various countries demanding the return of Soviet assets. None of them were won. The reasons for the failures were the same: the lack of direct evidence. The lawyers of the new account holders threw up their hands. Yes, the account exists, but prove that this money belonged specifically to the USSR and not to our respected company registered in the Cayman Islands. And how to prove it if the archives have been destroyed? Banks in turn hid behind the iron shield of banking secrecy. The situation often resembled a spy thriller. For example, in Cyprus, which became one of the centers for money laundering, it was possible to discover and freeze a fund with $4 billion, presumably related to the USSR. An investigation began. The press trumpeted victory. But after a few months, the fund unexpectedly changed jurisdiction, and the money disappeared in an unknown direction, dissolving in the labyrinth of offshore zones. And this was not an isolated case. Assets flowed from one offshore zone to another, like water through fingers, until their traces were completely lost. Behind these schemes were people with huge connections and the best lawyers, who masterfully used any loophole in international law. So who got this money? Where did that golden river that flowed out of the Soviet Union ultimately come? There are no direct answers supported by documents, but if you compare the facts, a fairly clear picture emerges. The disappearance of party money coincided surprisingly in time with another phenomenon of the 1990s. The rapid and, it would seem, enrichment of a narrow group of people that arose from nowhere who would later be called oligarchs. Many fortunes were created during privatization when factories, oil rigs, and entire industries were sold for next to nothing. But even to participate in these auctions required initial capital and a considerable amount. Where did it come from for former Komsomol leaders, researchers, and directors of red factories? One of the most convincing versions is that the billions withdrawn from the USSR became that initial capital. Money secretly taken out of the country returned to it in the form of foreign investments from anonymous offshore companies that bought up the most delicious pieces of the former Soviet economy. Thus, state money earned from the sale of national resources made a full circle. It was taken abroad, legalized, and then used to buy up the assets of the very state from which it was taken. This was not just privatization, it was privatization with the money of the country itself, but in the interests of a few. These funds allowed their new owners not only to become super-rich people, but also to gain enormous political influence, determining the vector of development of Russia and many other post-Soviet countries for many years to come. With each passing year, the chances of finding and returning at least part of this money become increasingly illusory. Legally proving something is almost impossible. There are fewer and fewer witnesses to those events, and international courts require an impeccable evidentiary base, which does not exist, and most likely never will. Even if somewhere in a quiet Swiss or Luxembourg bank there is still a sleeper Soviet account for $1 billion or $2, legally it has long ceased to be state-owned. It belongs to some Horns and Hooves Ltd. company registered in the British Virgin Islands, and its beneficiaries are reliably hidden behind several layers of nominal directors. Time and professional lawyers have done their job. Nevertheless, the hunt for the ghosts of Soviet gold does not stop. Periodically, as a result of information leaks such as the Panama Papers, the names of offshore firms and surnames emerge that indirectly indicate old Soviet schemes. Investigative journalists are collecting information bit by bit, trying to restore at least some fragments of this grandiose mosaic. But these are only fragments. Most likely, we will never see the whole picture. Theoretically, money can only be returned in one case, if there is the political will of the states where this money has settled, and if irrefutable documents are found. But the reality is that neither one nor the other is foreseen in the foreseeable future. The mystery of the disappeared billions will remain, perhaps, the greatest financial scam and unsolved crime of the 20th century. This is not just a story about money. This is a story about betrayal, about the colossal opportunities that were stolen from entire generations. And although the money itself has long dissolved in the global financial system, its ghostly legacy still determines the present and future of those countries that arose on the ruins of the great and contradictory Soviet Empire.